Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters from around the world. My name's Owen Bennet-Jones, and today we're asking the question, will Britain ever rejoin the European Union? Now, the opinion polls show that most Brits think Brexit was a mistake now. The 52% who voted to leave is now down in the polls to 33%. The immigration control that many Brexit voters hoped would happen hasn't really been delivered. The difficulties of trading have increased, as was predicted. But does all that mean Britain can go back in? Well, to answer that, we've got James Blitz, former political editor, defence editor, Whitehall editor at the Financial Times, and during the Brexit campaign, crucially for us on this, was the author of the daily Brexit briefing. So absolutely immersed in the campaign that resulted in Britain getting out. And James, I think the best place to start is just to understand why Britain didn't get in the first place. Why wasn't Britain in the European Union and the sort of pre-structures of the European community and so on before?
Well, first of all, hello, Owen, and hello, everybody who's following. It's a pleasure to be here. So to answer that first question, yes, the European community had its origins in 1957. That's when the six founder countries of the community, France, West Germany as it then was, Italy, the three Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, all came together to form a single common market. Britain looked at this with a bit quizzically to begin with, wasn't quite sure what to make of it. And then in the early 1960s, the government led by Harold Macmillan really wanted to get into it. The British economy wasn't doing well. We were in a post-imperial period after Suez. And Macmillan went up to de Gaulle and said, basically, we want to get in. And de Gaulle, General de Gaulle, the French leader at the time, famously said no in June 1963, famously causing Macmillan to burst into tears at a meeting between the two of them. He was terribly upset. De Gaulle replied, "Ne pleurez pas, milord," a phrase of Edith Piaf, "Don't cry, my lord." But in the end, we didn't go in. But the British kept banging away because the British economy wasn't doing well in the 1960s. We had a sterling crisis, and these were the years when the French and German and Italian economies were starting to do much better. And then in the early 1970s, we made a much more considered attempt to get in, and we joined on the 1st of January 1973. We immediately had doubts, however, and this is a key point you might want to explore. The country wasn't 100% sure whether it wanted to go in. There was a referendum in June 1975, and the British then did overwhelmingly vote to stay in the community because the basic backdrop to this period is we just weren't doing very well. And the feeling was we had to join in with the other countries of Europe.
Now, we've spoken about this before, and I was very interested in your explanation for why de Gaulle said no, which I hadn't previously realized. So can you talk us through why it was a no?
Well, de Gaulle was in many ways very prescient. I think he actually understood what the history of Britain and Europe would be for the following 60 years, basically, in fact, long after his death in 1970. And his basic concern was that the British were never going to be wholehearted members of any European community, that the country was fundamentally, it didn't have the same kind of social and economic structures of the Europeans, but in particular, we were always going to be divided between the United States and Europe. We were always going to want to have a much closer relationship with the Americans, so-called special relationship. In the early 1960s, we'd already begun, for example, to develop our nuclear weapons system, Polaris, thanks to the US. It was clear that we were going to be working hand in hand, Macmillan and Kennedy and so on and so forth, with the Americans. And that was basically has turned out to be true. The British have never been 100% sure whether they want to be closer to the US or closer to Europe. And it's a constant going one way and going the other. And even now, we are still really deluded, uncertain about exactly what our position is.
So de Gaulle was very prescient, actually.
Yes, he was, because we've been through this love-hate relationship with Europe, basically. We joined in 1973. We were then basically perfectly happy with it for about 20 or 30 years. And in fact, under Mrs. Thatcher, we developed many of the fundamental structures of the European community and European Union. The British were, with Mrs. Thatcher and Lord Cockfield, the British Commissioner at the time, the people who developed the single market, the level playing field in which one could transfer goods unhindered across the community. So we were enormously important in the development, the fundamental development of the European economy. But then unfortunately, in the period after, basically in the middle of the Blair period, we started to have serious doubts.
Now then, there's talk, amongst Remainers, people who want to stay in the European Union, of a second referendum. In fact, it would be a third referendum, wouldn't it? Because in 1973, there was a referendum, although it was after the event. Tell us about that referendum.
Yes, in 75, we had a referendum. Ted Heath had taken Britain into the European community, but it had been a very elite decision taken by the Heath government. There hadn't been any consultation with the British public over it at all. And the basic problem was that Harold Wilson then came in February and October 74, and the Labour Party was extremely divided over membership. Actually, it was Labour in the 1970s who had the real problem between pro-Europeans and Europhobes, which then went on to be a Tory problem. In the 1970s, it was an enormous problem, and many of the leading anti-Europeans were in were in Wilson's government. People like Peter Shaw, Tony Benn, and so on and so forth. So Wilson typically felt he couldn't really decide this within his own party, so he had to put it to a referendum, and the referendum was successfully passed.
Yes, exactly. And then we came to the second referendum, and it was out by 52 to 48. Now, you must have thought about this, many times in your Brexit briefing. If you had to summarize the reasons Britain left, three or four reasons, what would they be?
Well, I would say number one, this very deep uncertainty about whether our future really was with Europe, particularly given that the European Union was becoming more and more of a political project. Remember, one of the biggest developments that's happened inside the European Union in the last 25 years has been the development of the Eurozone and the euro and the single currency, and we weren't part of that. And what we were seeing was most of the countries in the European Union really coalescing around single currency, single interest rates, and so forth and so on and so forth. So we felt uncomfortable. Second enormous problem was the great concern about immigration that's developed in the country over the last 25 or 30 years. The British have always been really rather phobic about immigrants, however much we might like to think that we are a sort of liberal, easygoing country, open to immigration. Actually, the British instinctively aren't. They are quite skeptical about immigrants. And in particular, one of the biggest problems that the European Union created was that the single market, which is the core economic structure in the European Union, has at its core that there needs to be free movement of goods, capital, and in particular people, so that you had the free movement of Europeans coming into this country, and Britain's going into Europe, absolutely unhindered. Any European could come and work here without any work permit. And at a time of, basically after the 2008 financial crisis, when things started to get really rocky economically, the British just felt that immigration was at the core of their problems. One last reason, I think, why we left was that the case for staying in the EU was being put by the Cameron government, and Cameron and George Osborne, Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer in 2016. And they had, over the previous 6 years, taken the country through a period of economic austerity with an enormous decline in funding for our public services, declining cost of living, partly due to the financial crisis, but also economic policy, so that when Cameron turned around in June 2016 and said, this is something I want you to do, the British public said no. They were totally disaffected with his government, and they just said, we're not going to follow what the Prime Minister wants. So there was that domestic factor as well.
Partly voting against him rather than against the European Union. The flip side of that sort of rather difficult political context for the vote was that the Leave campaign was brilliantly run, right?
Yes, it was. It was run by this guy, Dominic Cummings, who's become an enormous figure of interest in British politics. But yes, it was totally cynical, and it had a few core totally incorrect, false messages about what the impact of leaving would be, and the British public bought them. The biggest of which, as you'll know, Owen, was the argument that if we were to leave, we would be able to inject 350 million pounds a year back into the NHS, and that was just a total lie, because in fact that it just simply wasn't the case. There was this assumption that the thing said that we're paying all this money into the EU. We were net contributors to the EU. It's true, as one of the richer countries in the EU, we were net contributors, and other countries in the Eastern Bloc were actually net recipients. But the fact is that even by leaving, there was absolutely no way that this was going to pour more money into the British National Health Service, because in the end, there were all sorts of other things we were getting out of Europe that had nothing to do with that.
And then there was another aspect of that campaign to leave, which was the early use of digital technology, wasn't it? And mass data, big data.
Yes, Cummings was a very clever user of that sort of thing. They were generally much more skillful on their feet, the anti-Europeans. But I wouldn't. This wasn't one of those votes where there was some kind of technical reason why it was lost by the government, by the pro-Europeans. The real problems were the ones I was talking about earlier, which were disaffection with the Cameron government, deep concern about immigration, accepting the lies, the broad lies of the Leave side. Those were the major factors.
Now then, so Britain's been out now for some years, and can you give us your analysis as a senior FT journalist? What has the record of Brexit been?
As far as the UK is concerned, totally negative. I mean, I personally think it's been a disaster. I think nearly 8 years after the departure from the EU in June 2016, I think it's impossible to name a single positive consequence of our decision to leave. First of all, as far as the economy is concerned, things have really gone very badly. What we've done is we are a country of 67 million, which has left a giant free trading area of 450 million people with the complete free flowing of goods across it. Historically, it's incredibly rare for a country to do what the British have done, to leave a free trade area like that in the way we have. The net result of it is that for British businesses, it's enormously bureaucratic to sell anything into Europe. Our exports have gone down by about 10%. The projection, the assumption of most leading economic commentators, including the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility in Britain, is that the UK GDP will contract by around 4% over this period, and may go up by but that contraction may be even more. If you look at our economic performance compared to other countries in the EU, compare us, for example, to Poland, a country which left the sort of absolutely dark days of communism and Comecon in the late 1980s, early 90s. The projection is that Poland's per capita income will be higher than that of the UK for the first time by the end of this decade. The Poles are actually going to end up richer than we are. As far as immigration is concerned, we have done nothing to control inward migration into this country, because the basic problem in the UK is that we need people to do fundamental jobs in the NHS, in social care, in retail, and we want people, overseas students, to come and study in our universities, because they need to shore up a university system which is desperate for cash. And as a result, the latest net migration figures for the last year have been plus 730,000 into this country. So, and the reason for that is, although we've stopped migration from the EU into this country, we're taking loads and loads of people from outside the EU, especially the Indian subcontinent, to fill in all those jobs. And of course, when they come and work here, because it's a much bigger step for them than Europeans coming to work here, they tend to bring their wider family group with them as well. So on that front as well, it's been a disaster. And there's been a general sense that Britain really has gone down the league table in terms of its influence in the world. The US has always taken the view, especially under the Biden administration, that its relationship with the UK is to some degree, it's obviously the security side, but it's to a large degree based on the belief that the UK was a particularly useful ally as a bridge into the European Union, as a way of influencing the European Union, and that has now gone. And so you see world leaders dealing much more with the Europeans. Macron, for example, is tomorrow at the National Day in India. Biden deals much more with the French and Germans, and so on and so forth.
Now, well, just say at this stage, if anyone would like to ask a question, then if you either raise a hand or write a comment in the Q&A area, then we will very much pick up on that and get you involved. You have, just given a very clear criticism of post-Brexit Britain. The Conservative Party, kicked out many of its Remainers, and so it basically is a Brexit party now, a very strong Brexit party. How many people are you aware of in the Conservative Party who, I guess at this stage, still privately, at the top parliamentary level, government level, how many of them are privately saying this was a mistake?
Well, I think they have a range of views. I think a lot of the strong pro-Brexiters in the party would argue that things haven't gone well, but they just will say that Brexit hasn't been done properly enough. There are all kinds of things we should have done, which we haven't done. Like, for example, we should have just completely ripped out loads and loads of EU laws, which was the intention. They had the intention of doing this, taking a lot more EU legislation or legislation that was created by our membership of the EU out of the EU statute book, and that hasn't been done. So there's people who would say that. There's a lot of people who would say that these first few years have been badly upset by two factors that have got absolutely nothing to do with Brexit. One of them is the pandemic that's happened, which significantly increased UK national debt. And secondly, the conflict with Putin, the rise in energy prices, and so on. And so, although the British economy is in a malaise, it's not got so much to do with Brexit. It's more to do with those things. I didn't personally think that's true. We're still, all the other countries were basically affected by all this, the pandemic and the Russia thing. We are still well below economically, we have not recovered from the period of the pandemic anything like as much as other countries. So they come up with all their excuses. What you don't find within the Conservative Party, and indeed you don't find much within the Labour Party, is an all-out statement that the whole thing has been an absolute disaster and we've just got to go back in. We still haven't reached that point.
Yes, I mean, let's just sort of emphasise that point, that the opposition Labour Party in the UK has been well ahead in the polls, 20 points ahead, between 15 and 20 points for months and months and months. And there's likely to be an election in the autumn, and it is widely expected that the Labour Party will win it. But we're now getting on to our topic of will we rejoin? Because the Labour Party is not saying we will need to get closer to Europe. I think I'm right in saying it's not even saying we need to rejoin the single market. Tell us where Labour is.
It is exactly there. The basic problem you've got in this country right now is the British are absolutely traumatized by Brexit. They're traumatized by the whole European discussion. And so that's almost like a kind of vow of Sicilian omertà in this country that nobody will discuss Europe. If you go on to look at a television program in this country or a radio discussion, there is almost no discussion about Brexit and the European relationship, because the whole thing over the last 7 years has been utterly traumatic, with huge numbers of changes of prime minister, government, terrible scenes in the House of Commons. Everybody's feeling poor and nobody wants to discuss it at all. So that is the first problem that there is a kind of trauma that not wanting to discuss it. The problem for Keir Starmer, Keir Starmer is basically somebody who, in his heart of hearts, would want us to go back into the EU. He never really hid that when he was the Brexit spokesman of the Labour Party before becoming leader in 2019, 2020. He never really hid that at all. The basic problem for Labour is that although Labour is massively ahead in the polls, it's very, very cautious about upsetting pro-Brexit, anti-European constituencies in this country. Why is that? Basically because Starmer needs to be sure of winning every single vote that he possibly can. He needs to for the following reasons. One, the Labour performance in 2019 was actually historically absolutely terrible. Under Jeremy Corbyn, it did disastrously. And so they really have got to work very hard indeed. Even though they're ahead in the polls, they've got to maintain that lead as best they can. That's number one. Number two is, and it's technical, but I won't go on about it very long, but basically, historically, Labour has always won in Britain by sweeping the board in Scotland. If you go back to 1997, 2005, 1997, 2001, 2005. Labour won hugely in the general election in Scotland, but the emergence of the Scottish National Party as a kind of nationalist group in Scotland means that's very difficult for Labour, which means that Starmer has to win very, very big indeed in England and Wales. He can't afford to lose lots of seats in the north of England, which the Tories won by a very small amount in 2019, but where there are a lot of voters who are still very pro-Brexit. So he needs to be careful about those people. That's basically politically why he's cautious.
Okay, and we're going to go to some questions now, but just to hit home this point, we've got opinion polls saying 66% now are suspicious about Brexit or against Brexit, think it was a mistake, and yet absolutely nobody at the top level of British politics from the main parties representing that 66%. It is an extraordinary situation. Let's go to Sheila. Sheila, your question.
Yes, I think it's already been touched on, but did the Conservative Party make Brexit worse than it could or should have been? And could they or anybody have handled it any better?
Yes, I mean, if you were a Brexiteer and not living in a fantasy world, actually sort of real politician trying to do it right, James, what could they have done to make it work better?
Well, they made an enormous number of mistakes right at the start, and many of them were made under Theresa May. As you know, you may know, Sheila, David Cameron was the Prime Minister who held the referendum. He then immediately resigned after it was after it was lost, and Theresa May took over. And Theresa May basically took the country down the road of a much, much harder Brexit, a much bigger break from the EU than we really had to have. You could have had a number of models for our decision for the way we implemented the Brexit decision, which could have been a lot softer and a lot more in the interests of the British economy. So, for example, we could have stayed in the single market, which would have left us within the sort of frictionless economic playing field at the centre of the EU. We just leave the political side of it, but stay in that. For example, like Norway. Norway has that relationship. It's outside the EU, but it's basically in the single market. We could have done that. We could have stayed in the customs union, which is basically an organization which effectively means that if you're inside it, you can still have an enormous amount of transfer of goods. It's just imposes a kind of tariff on goods that come from outside. We could have done that. We could have decided to keep a lot of sectors protected within the EU. For example, there are lots of things we are actually still protecting where we are still under the European Court of Justice, but they tend to be in the area of justice and home affairs. We still apply the rules regarding the European arrest warrant. But we could have widened that much more to say, here are lots of sectors of the economy, the chemicals industry, the car industry, absolutely crucially, food and agriculture. We could have said, let's just keep aligned with all that and accept some of the remit of the European Court of Justice. That would have been a perfectly reasonable way of interpreting the decision to leave the political structures, but keep these trading relationships. We didn't want to do that. We ended up going down because of May's mistakes, and then because of Johnson's extremism, we went down an extremely hard road, which in the end was totally impractical for our economy.
Steve Kenny, you got a question? Hi, Steve. Can you hear me?
What I did wrong. Okay. Sorry.
Right. No problem.
You guys are doing a terrific job. I'm in Portland, Oregon, and I have a lot of catching up to do on what you're talking about. And it's been very clear and logical. I'm 83 years old, and I agree with you entirely. To solve a big problem, it usually takes somebody prominent to admit they made a big mistake. And I'm just trying to remember any politicians at all who actually came out flatly and say, I blew it. I made a huge mistake. So who's most likely, James, to turn around and admit they made a mistake and provide some leadership?
Well, the person most likely to begin to get us out of this mess is the Labour leader, the opposition Labour leader, Keir Starmer, if, as expected, he wins, as Owen has said, the general election expected in November. Now, Keir Starmer is not going to take us back into the European Union. That isn't going to happen. I just don't think in this country the British could go through another referendum and another sifting through all of these arguments in the way that they did between about 2016 and 2020. It's just not going to happen. There's a sense as well that, we had a vote in 2016. It's very rare to have a referendum in this country. And so the decision that was taken by the British people has a kind of sacred status. And a lot of people will get tremendously upset. Even pro-Europeans acknowledge we had a referendum, it's sacred. You can't just go and reverse it within about 10 years. So I don't think there's going to be leadership to take us down that road. I don't think we're going to enter into, unfortunately, the single market of the EU in the way in which, as I said, Norway does. Norway's outside the EU, but nevertheless, it's accepted. It's going to have free movement of people from Europe. It's going to accept free movement of capital. I just don't think that's going to work for the British, because it effectively means that the EU would end up making a lot of legal decisions affecting sectors of the UK economy, especially the City of London. And I just don't think the British will accept the lack of democracy there. But I do think that Starmer will start to take us over the next few years down a road that says we've got to do everything we possibly can to boost economic growth in the UK, which is we've got by far and away the worst performing country in the G7 at the moment in terms of economic growth. And so we've got to go down this road of getting bespoke trade agreements in key sectors, as I said, like the motor industry, the car industry, food and agriculture, carbon emissions, visa travel and so on, bespoke deals in which we're basically saying, look, we're going to have a lot more free movement in those sorts of areas, and we're going to accept some of the remit of the European Court of Justice, and we'll do that in the interests of the British economy. I think he can take us down that road. He's got the intelligence, especially if he has a very big majority at the election, which is possible given the very strong lead that Labour has. He can take us down that road, but it's going to be a slower escape from the problem, I'm afraid, than people like myself would like.
Thank you.
Diane, yeah, thanks, Steve. Diane Cook, you've got a question.
Yes, I did, and I can't now see it on screen, so I've got to.
I can help you, because I can see it on screen.
Yes, I've got to rethink it. Agree your analysis, but where do we go from here? Because no one is offering the British people, and leave aside what I mean by the British people, because we have other issues, but nobody is really offering us a vision. And it seems to me that particularly business and commerce have been overlooked entirely in all of this. And you speak to business people, it's really hard just knowing what your parameters are and where you're in which you're working. So I guess the question I have is, where does the money come from to support our country going forward?
Well, it's a very, very good question, Diane. I mean, the unfortunate reality for the British, I'm afraid, is that we are, I'm afraid, as a country in pretty dire economic straits right now. Not terrible. We're not Argentina or anything like that. But we are in a situation where we've got very low economic growth. We've got an enormous problem with productivity in the UK economy. We don't have any commanding industries in the key sectors in the world economy these days, like tech. There are almost no big tech companies in the FTSE 100. We have things like some of our manufacturing industry is being increasingly emasculated. We've seen the closure of the last steelworks in the last few days in the UK. And so that's a problem in terms of we don't have the motor to generate economic growth, number one. Number two, we have a really big fiscal problem. We have debt at the highest levels. Debt to GDP ratio for the UK government is at the highest level it's been now since the 1950s, at about 90 to 100%. It's extremely difficult, therefore, to raise extra money for core areas of the economy that need cash, in particular our public services, unless we go ahead and raise tax. But of course, both the Conservatives and Labour are being very sheepish about the question of raising tax. And so not only do we have a difficulty in investing in public services, but in the end, if you really want to grow the UK economy, you have to start putting an enormous amount more money into research and development. And we just don't have the indigenous cash to do that because we're not raising money through tax. Our public services are really, really dry in terms of funding, and our debt level is high. The way most economies get out of a problem like this is to basically do a dash for growth, do everything possible to grow. And one of the first things, therefore, that we've got to do is open up all of these trading relationships with the European Union and with the single market that we've lost, because we're certainly not replicating them by having any new relationships with the rest of the world. We don't have a trade deal with the US. We've signed a trade deal with Australia, but it's not particularly helpful for the UK economy. It's actually much more helpful for the Australian economy, as a former minister actually admitted recently. And so going down that road of trying to boost our export markets into Europe is the way to go. But as I explained in an earlier answer, at the moment, nobody's really talking about it very much because Starmer needs to win as many votes as he can.
Now, let's just pretend there was an amazingly charismatic politician that somehow unified the British public around a position that they wanted to rejoin. And, there was enthusiasm in Britain for rejoining, and, a national consensus emerged that that would be the right thing to do. Would Europe have Britain back?
That's a very good question that we haven't looked at. And the short answer is it would be an extremely long and difficult process. The first thing that's important to say is that if we did go back into the European Union, we would have none of the huge benefits we had before we left. I mean, one of the things which is so tragic about the British position is, to use that old phrase of Harold Macmillan, we've never had it so good. We had it so brilliantly good inside the EU for the following reasons. We were inside the single market, so we had all this free flow of goods that we could sell all the way down to Greece and all the rest of it, no problems at all, fully fledged members of the market. But number one, we didn't want to be in the Eurozone, and so we weren't going to go in there. The British never wanted to go in, never would want to go in. They've got a thing about the pound, they're never going to want to go, so we didn't do that. We had a fantastic budget rebate for agriculture because we weren't members of the CAP. So we got about £1 billion a year in from Europe as part of a budget rebate we had. We were not part of the Schengen agreement for the free movement of people without having to waive your passports. Any Europeans that came to this country had to waive their passports when they got to Dover, basically. Again, that was something the British wanted. We had that. Now, if we go back in, the Europeans are going to say, forget the past. You're going to be in the Eurozone. There's not going to be a rebate. You're going to be in Schengen, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to be that's the first thing that's going to happen, because the Europeans are going to say, look, let's be honest here. You've taken us through this once before. You joined in 1975, and you then decided you didn't want to be in anymore. And let's be honest. You might have Starmer, for example, now here. He might win in 2024, but then in 2029, you never know. The Tories might completely reform, get a party back in, led by, I don't know, Suella Braverman, and want to take us out again. So the Europeans are going to drive an incredibly hard bargain if we are to go back into the European Union. And so it's possible they might say yes. And given the wider geopolitical context, there are two factors. One, the possibility of the reemergence of Trump, and two, the continuing pressure from Putin. There will be a strong argument in Europe that says, good to have Britain back in, reunites Europe, stronger community and so on. But they will make those very substantial demands. They will drive a very hard bargain.
Let me just ask you about, and again, if anyone's got questions, please do put them in the Q&A box or raise a hand, and we'll get you involved. Can you just talk us through what happened in Northern Ireland? I mean, it's not, the central issue to this, but it is an important issue, and it was one of the places most disrupted by Brexit. Can you just, it's complicated, but can you explain what happened and where we got to?
Yeah, basically Northern Ireland was always in an extremely complicated position, because one of the issues was that there is only one land border between the United Kingdom and the European Union. And that land border was on the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. And so once we'd left everything, single market, customs union, European Union, and so on, the Europeans turned around and said, well, ideally, we've got to have some kind of border there between Northern Ireland and the Republic. Otherwise, you're going to be just smuggling loads and loads of goods without any of the proper checks that we have into Southern Ireland and then into the European Union. But at the same time, the European Union also accepted that one of the biggest things that had happened politically in Europe in the last 50 years had been peace in Northern Ireland. And one of the ways we got peace in Northern Ireland was that the Northern Irish and the Republic accepted that there wouldn't be any kind of border between the two countries, that effectively you would have a sense that they were all part of one unit. And so nobody, in fact, wanted to restore this border. So the question was, how would you therefore check goods that were coming from Northern Ireland into the Republic and from the Republic into Northern Ireland? There was an enormous debate about this. How do you do it? You can't have a border between the two countries. You could have a border down the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and the rest of Great Britain and check goods there. But then people said, well, that's dividing up Britain. So that was a problem. They couldn't do that. In the end, a very special status was given to Northern Ireland, where they basically are not politically in the European Union. They're still part of the United Kingdom, but they're in the single market. They're the one bit of the UK which is actually in the single market and has the right to have free-flowing trade with the rest of the EU, even though it's still part of the United Kingdom. What happened there was the EU was incredibly generous. It gave a gift to the British that it would give to no other country. It basically said, you can be in the single market and we're not going to check anything, even though you're in another country. It was an exceptional gift.
Because of the risk of violence coming back, basically.
Basically, the Europeans understood that the last thing they wanted to do was put a border down the middle of Ireland, which would just blow up the whole Northern Irish, the whole Good Friday Agreement again.
Now, if you go to a Brexit household, and Brexit households tend to be the older generation, who are in favour of this still with enthusiasm, one of the things you'll hear is, we were right to get out. Europe's in crisis. The whole thing's about to collapse. They're in a terrible state in the European Union, and it's just as well we're not any part of it anymore. How real, and there are real elements to that. Hungary, perhaps you could talk us through it, is a major challenge to the European Union. How serious are the divisions within the European Union, and how poor the prospects of the European Union?
Well, the first thing to say is that 7 years after we left, after the referendum, there is not a single government or a single major political party in the whole of the 28 countries of the European Union, 500 million people, that wants to follow what the British have done. Not one. Every single country looks at the UK and says, we don't want to go there. We don't want to do what they did. In Italy, you have a party led by Giorgia Meloni, the Fratelli d'Italia, which are the intellectual, if you can call it, or not the intellectual, but the heirs of Mussolini and fascism, okay? They've got leading figures in that party who 7 or 8 years ago would have done everything possible on being elected to take Italy out of the Eurozone and the EU. They're not touching it. They're going absolutely nowhere near it, because almost everybody has been inoculated against the British experience. They've just looked at Britain and said, disaster. So a breakaway by any of these countries from the EU has now become, in fact, much less likely. I mean, Marine Le Pen has a decent chance, I would say, of winning the presidency finally in France in 2027. Macron has to stand down. There's a lot of expectation that the Front National will finally do it. A few years ago, again, she was a major Europhobe. All that has gone. So the idea that somehow Europe is going to undermine the European nation states are going to undermine the EU doesn't feel right. Now, you're absolutely right that Hungary is a thorn in the side of the EU, basically on political rights. The Hungarian leadership is, it operates in a rather sort of, it's a pretty dictatorial, authoritarian country and so on. I don't know Hungary well. But at the same time, although you've got the Hungarians being a thorn on the side, you've also seen in Poland exactly the opposite happening, which was you had under Kaczynski's, under the previous Polish government, a really very anti-European stance, a very nationalist stance. Poland doing all sorts of things that seem to be breaking with the rule of law. And then a few weeks ago, Donald Tusk, a leading pro-European, leading moderate, was elected as prime minister. So Poland has actually gone back to actually restoring a lot of the unity and stability of Europe around the table. So it's difficult to know. I mean, Europe certainly faces massive problems, but I wouldn't at this moment say, it was certainly the case they faced an enormous problem over the Eurozone in 2011, over the Greek crisis, that is right, and the Eurozone really did come close to a major problem, and it also faced a major problem with the huge migration flows that happened in 2015 because of the crises in Syria, Afghanistan, and so on. But I don't see those being big problems now. Europe, I think, at the moment is pretty united around the fact that, one, they're facing Putin, and that threat isn't going away. So that's going to keep the Europeans together. And secondly, if Trump makes it in November for a second term, all of the momentum is going to be to try and get Europe back on the same page, and if possible, bring the British, at least politically and diplomatically, on board, rather than having some kind of centrifugal breakup.
Let me just follow up on that with a question about Ukraine and Trump. So let's say Trump does win. And even if Trump doesn't win, let's say that the opinion polls in America, which as I understand it are saying something like 60, 66% or something, are opposing funding the Ukraine war. Let's say that feeds through into a political decision from Trump or from Biden to reduce or stop the aid to Ukraine. And this is a problem that goes back before the EU. I mean, Europe is not used to paying for its own defense. Now, will the Europeans be able to fund the Ukraine struggle sufficiently to prevent Russian advances?
Well, if America pulls out under Trump, it's going to be tremendously difficult. There's no question about it. I mean, you know, I did write about defense for quite a few years, and the starting point of any discussion like this is that the US spends more as a country on defense than the whole of the rest of the world put together. I mean, it is simply a colossal defense budget, and they are doing all of the heavy lifting, and they always do all of the heavy lifting. I mean, you know, the British at the moment and the say that they're joining the Americans in sort of attacking the Houthis in Yemen. I mean, it's the same old story. The Americans are doing 95% of the work there. We're doing 5%. We're just there to show that we're sort of on board. That's about it. It's the same, I'm afraid, with Ukraine. I mean, if Trump pulls out, the Europeans are going to be in a mess. Now, there's a lot the Europeans can do to come together. The problem with European defense has always been not so much one of spending. They're all actually spending quite a lot of money collectively. They're just not coordinating enough. That has always been the problem. Everybody does their own thing. They've got their own fighters and all the rest of it. There are attempts to coordinate things, but there's going to have to be an awful lot more of that. And the pressure, I think, will be on the British to sort of pool resources much more with France and Germany. And we have to also recognize that Germany is now, under Scholz, spending a great deal more on its military budget than it has done in the past. So it's going to be difficult. But the pressure will be on the Europeans to pool their resources as much as possible.
Can I see, I think I saw a hand up from Karen, is that right? Did I see a hand going up? Maybe not. I thought I did. So let's just follow that through. Because, you know, increasingly people in the States are saying this is a real possibility that Trump wins. And obviously, you've just explained to us why the European Union will not be able to match the budget funding that the Americans have given. Where does that leave European politics? I mean, it does seem to me that those people who are saying there's a crisis in the European Union would then be right. And you know, European defence policy has always been very difficult because different countries have different interests and they've not really unified on this.
Well, that is correct. I mean, as I say, I think in this country, a lot of people have, you asked a question a couple of questions ago about how British politicians say Europe will sort of divide up and all the rest of it. Because of Putin and Trump, I don't think if it is Trump, I don't think it will, but it will have to do a lot more to come together. Now, there are some things that have been done in the last year and a half and Sunak, the British Prime Minister, has accepted them to try and start talking a bit more realistically about politics and diplomacy with the European Union. So not the trade stuff, which is always all neuralgic and terribly difficult, but there are now these meetings which involve a wider political community than just the EU, which are bringing in countries on the periphery, including the UK, and say, let's all get around the table and talk politics, talk defence, and so on. So that will certainly continue. And I think if Starmer's elected, he'll be very, very up for that. There's no question about that. But I think the more difficult thing is really going to be pooling military forces operationally outside. You know, if America comes out, it comes out of NATO. And there are all sorts of questions then about what are your defense structures that are actually, how are your defense structures in these countries lining up against Russia? Because if NATO is paralyzed a bit because of US obstructionism, you may find that the EU and EU plus UK has to do a good deal more work to try and come together.
Let's bring it back to the UK as we close this. You've talked a lot now about what's happening in Europe and what the difficulties may be ahead. And you've explained why you don't think any political leaders are going to take us back in. But there is a sort of exception to that, I guess, which is Scotland. Now, you know, the opinion polls in Scotland are roughly now 50-50 on independence, pro-independence, anti-independence. And it is possible that the 55-45 vote to stay in the UK next time there's a referendum would be different. Would Scotland get back in? They say, the National Party say they want to get back in. Would Europe take Scotland? Could Scotland get back in on its own?
I think it's very difficult. And I think it's difficult for one big reason, which is that the Spanish wouldn't allow it. The Spanish look at Scotland and its separatism in the UK with enormous concern. Now, when I say the Spanish, I mean the Madrid government, because they've got the problem with Catalonia. I mean, the Madrid government in Spain has been fighting Catalonian independence for a long, long time. And of course, you know, the Catalans have really tried to take the law into their own hands and actually held their own referendum. It wasn't approved by the Madrid government. There's been a very, very unpleasant story of separatism there over the last 4 or 5 years. If Scotland were to turn around and say, right, we are an independent country, somehow, which I don't think they can now, but even if they did, if independence did rear its head again, hasn't completely gone away. A lot of Scots are still very bent on independence. If it did come back, and they then said, actually, one of the arguments for independence is that we, Scotland, can be inside the single market or inside the European Union, by the way, in the same way that Northern Ireland now is, because of the special arrangement it has. I think the problem there that the spat will be that this is something which would only be accepted by the EU on a unanimous vote. It's a constitutional issue, and Spain would just say, we're not doing this. If you allow Scotland to break away like that and have its own country separate with the EU, that is exactly what the Catalans are. You're going to inflame the whole Catalan thing, and we don't want it. So that is the fundamental reason why this thing isn't going to work.
But just to get a sense of how Europe thinks, are there others in Europe, in France maybe, in Germany, elsewhere, who would love to give England a black eye and say, let's get Scotland in, it will humiliate the English?
I think there was that feeling between 2016 and 2018, very roughly, in the immediate aftermath of the referendum here. I think there were European leaders who said, we just want the whole thing to go badly for the British. If the Scots want to break away, and Scottish independence was immediately after the EU referendum was really galvanised. Let's talk to Scotland. Let's have it separate. Let's do all that. There were politicians doing it. I think the mood is different now. I think, assuming Starmer wins, they know they're going to be dealing with somebody a lot more sensible, somebody who isn't a Europhobe, somebody who isn't coming across with crazy ideological ideas. We've got to deal with this country. It's a serious guy. There are big problems in the world. So let's not start fiddling around with some kind of Scottish leadership. The backdrop to all this as well, as you know, though, is that Scottish National Party is going through an absolutely terrible time now. Nicola Sturgeon was a brilliant leader for them. They lost Alex Salmond through sort of personal problems. Then they've lost Nicola Sturgeon over a whole load of internal corruption allegations that have happened, the economic, public policy, public services performance in Scotland of the SNP is terrible. They're not going to do well in the national general election. Not going to do terribly, but they're going to be below 40 seats, almost certainly. So it's going to be a defeat for them. And so I don't think anybody in Europe who's sensible is going to start wanting to do deals, look at them and think that's some kind of future bridge we can start working with.
And just a last question to you, James. The debate in Britain really was so divisive, and families split on it. I mean, it was one of those really visceral issues, and younger generations would go to, grandparents for Christmas and have furious rows about this. And it was traumatic. Is that sense of trauma over? I mean, I'm not convinced it is. It's still very bitterly felt, isn't it?
No, it is still terrible. I mean, I think for your colleague viewers here who are watching this from outside the UK, this is still a subject where you can have a really, really bad argument across the dinner table with people if you're not careful. People just don't want to talk about it. It's too traumatic. It's too stressful. And that's why, as I say, on a television program in this country, people don't want to address it. They know it's been a disaster, but it's just, they don't, it's like they want it all to go away somehow. And I'm afraid it isn't going to go away. It's going to have to be dealt with. But I'm afraid, to end on a really rather bad note, this is, I'm afraid, one of those terrible political mistakes which is just not going to be reversed and erased at all, quickly or easily. It's going to take a generation to do it. I'm afraid I don't think I'm going to be alive to see the resolution of this. It's a 30, we went in to the European community in 1975. We came out 41 years later in 2016. It's going to be 40 years before we go back in.
Thank you very much, James. Is Steve there? Steve Kenny? I think he may have signed off. Steve Kenny? No. Anyway, you have, I think Steve's in the States, and you have a very big supporter. He said it's one of the best webinars he's heard, and he's very grateful to you, James, for being so, and I can understand why, extremely clear analysis of what's happened, why it's happened, and where it's going. So look, we're very grateful to you. And let me just say that I should remind everyone that there are tours on the political tour schedule going forward, and I think that Nicholas will be putting that up in a way that you can see them, so that you can see where he's going. He just told me he's got an absolutely fascinating one on English football, well, even Welsh football, actually, so British football, and how it's all financed, coming up quite soon. So there are lots of interesting trips coming up, and Nicholas can keep everyone up to date with that. But for now, thank you very much to you, James, and from Owen Bennet-Jones here in London, goodbye.